I'm going to show you how I easily and affordably turned this plain wall into this. If only it was that easy, right? In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I installed this frame molding wall all by myself without any help and on a budget. I'll also be showing you tips and tricks along the way to make the job as seamless as possible. This was actually my first time doing anything like this, and I think that it turned out pretty well. And the reason that I'm sharing that is because if I can do it, you definitely can as well, and I'm going to show you how. By the way, hi, my name is Sally, and I'm an expat living in the Middle East, sharing all things lifestyle. I wanted to mention that this is actually our rental property, and I think that this frame molding tutorial is renter friendly because you can eventually take it down and then cover up your tracks. But obviously that will be another tutorial, so you'll have to subscribe for that one when I eventually decide to take down this frame molding and share how. But without further ado, let's get started. First up, here's what you are going to need: a measuring tape, a ruler, a spirit level, a pencil, rails and frames of choice, miter box and saw, pin nails, wall anchors and screws, screwdriver, drill, hammer, caulk, wood filler, lint-free rag, sandpaper, primer, paint, paintbrush, paint roller, and painter's tape. Step 1 is to create a mood board of what you are going for with your frame molding. For this project, I wanted to use a frame molding as a feature wall behind the bed to add some style and color. I opted for a simple, even frame for the panels, and then a nice design for the chair rail to complete the look. Before we continue, I just wanted to share one more thing with you. I actually filmed this and put up this frame molding wall about 8 months ago. As mentioned, I am an expat and I'm based in Qatar, and here it gets so hot in summer, and this wall has survived that. So that's saying something. But also, I'm going to take you back in time to where I bought the supplies here. And don't worry, if you're not based in Qatar, I will link some other options down below for you for where you can find all the supplies that you need for this project. Or, I think this one is really good.
That is nice.
Yeah.
Perfect. Sure. There it is.
Now let's dive into the steps of this tutorial. Step 2 is to check what wall you're working with. If it is a solid wall, it's going to sound dense and feel very hard. If it's a gypsum or plasterboard, it's going to sound hollow. We will be working with plasterboard in this tutorial, thankfully, because it is so much easier to work with. Now that you've determined what type of wall you have to work with, you want to measure the height and width so that you can calculate the frame sizes you will need. I believe this is personal preference, so go with what looks best to you. I'll share all of my measurements in a blog post linked in the description box below for you. A little tip: if you are measuring the wall alone, you can use painter's tape to hold the tape along the wall. If you're wondering why I didn't just measure along the floor, it's because the walls are not always even, and I wanted the exact height from one corner to the other for the chair rail. Once you've determined all the measurements, it's time to mark up the wall with a pencil to see where you'll be nailing the frame molding panels. Be sure to use a spirit level to make sure your markings are perfectly horizontal and vertical. The next tip is to use some cheap painter's tape to mark out the frame molding so you can get a visual of what your project will look like on the wall before you start nailing in the wooden frames. Luckily, my frame molding will not intersect with any outlet, but if yours does, be sure to measure those frames accordingly. I'm not sure what happened to the audio here, but I'm saying I'm happy with how this tape looks, and now it's time to remove it and cut the wood to size. Measure the wooden framing and the chair rail, and then cut the wood to size. I used a miter box and saw set that I clamped to an old bench. I purchased this miter set from my local hardware store, but I'll link something similar below for you. Most tutorials use professional electrical tools for this, but I wanted something that was low cost, easy to use, and available to anyone, especially those who have never done this before, like me. To trim the wood, utilize the miter box to make a 45-degree cut at one end of the frame. Then, at the opposite end, cut another 45-degree angle at a perpendicular angle. The measurements you make on your wood are the longest edge, end to end. Here is a visual of what I am talking about. Another tip, cut one piece to size and then use that piece as your reference piece to cut the rest of the wood. To neaten the edges, sand away rough edges with a fine grit sandpaper. I didn't have this when I was filming the tutorial, but I suggest making your life easier by getting some miter shears. They are not that expensive and it makes it so much faster cutting the frames. Having said that, you still need the miter box for the chair rail, which we will be cutting next. Use an extra piece of wood to prop up the rail so that it's level on the miter box. The wall is quite long, so I needed 2 chair rail pieces. I left one at full length and then trimmed the second one so that they'd both fit on the wall perfectly. Once the wood is cut to length, mark out 3 hole locations on the thinnest part of the chair rail, one in the middle and one on either end. Then, with a spare piece of wood underneath, so that you don't drill into your floor, drill the holes in the chair rail for the screws. Check that the holes are the right size by screwing in the screws. All measurements and supplies are written in the blog post linked in the description box below. Now double check the height of where you want your chair rail to be. Place the chair rail on the wall using a spirit level to make sure it is perfectly horizontal at the height you want, and then make a mark on the wall through the holes that you created. Now, drill holes into the wall to attach your drywall anchors. If you are working alone like me, screw the screws into the wood before trying to place it on the wall, so that you aren't trying to juggle screws, screwdrivers, and a chair rail with only 2 hands. Also, when you are screwing the screws into the anchors, make sure your screws go in all the way so they are slightly hidden in the wood. This will help when you cover them up with the wood filler. Most tutorials will tell you to use a brad nailer for this, but my chair rails are quite heavy, so I wanted something that would be more secure on this drywall. And using these anchors and screws are a much cheaper option than buying a brad nailer. Now it's time to add the frame. Again, you can use a brad nailer, but I decided to go for some pin nails. Partially nail the pin nails into the frame. This again makes it easier to put on the wall without having to juggle a leveler, a hammer, nails, and then the frame with only 2 hands. Hammer in the top frame first, making sure to place the frame on the markings you've made, but still using a spirit level to make sure the frames are horizontal. Next, add the right and left frames, still using the spirit level as you hammer down to make sure it is properly vertical. Finally, attach the bottom part of the frame. The reason you should go in this order is that it ensures the most even installment. I didn't use any glue for this because this is a rental property, and I wanted to make it easy to remove the frames without tearing down the drywall in the process. Also, if you're wondering how many nails I used in the frames, or if you had any more questions, you can either ask me in the comment box below or check out the detailed blog post that I've linked in the description box that has everything outlined there. Cork your work to ensure a seamless finished look. I used this quick seal cork and it made my life so much easier. Whatever cork you use, make sure it's paintable cork because we're going to be painting the walls. Run a thin line of cork between the wall and the frame, making sure to smooth it out with your finger and then clean it up with a moist, lint-free cloth. If you make a mess, you can also clean that up straight away with a moist rag. Be sure to smooth it out before it dries because it cannot be sanded once it is dry. Also, don't forget to cork the chair rail. This particular cork took about 2 hours to dry. Once the cork was dry, I sanded the frame corners a little to tidy them up, and then I used wood filler to neaten the look of the joint. To do this, apply wood filler, use your finger to push it into the seams, and then with a damp cloth, wipe away the excess. I did the same for the holes in the chair rail and some of the little pin holes. The wood filler dried within an hour and then I sanded it to even it out. I used wood filler instead of cork for the chair rail joint because wood filler can be sanded, and as mentioned, cork cannot be sanded. Once everything is sanded, you want to take a dry, clean cloth and wipe away any dust and debris before you move on to the next step. Now it's time to prime and paint the wall. Before you start, lay down an old sheet or some garbage bags to protect the floors. I used this Zinsser water-based primer to prep the wood. Make sure you give it a really good stir before you use it. A little tip, instead of messing up your paint tin, add a stick or chopstick in the middle like this to remove excess paint off your brush. Then, paint the wooden components of your project. I didn't bother to prime the walls because I didn't feel it was necessary. Also, a little mistake that I made, although not a big deal because my walls are white, but use painter's tape to cover the areas that you don't want painted before you get started with the priming or any of the painting. This includes outlets and even the styled edges of the chair rail. Now it's time to paint with color. The color I use for this wall is a water-based interior paint called Balance 6325 by Jotan Paints. As mentioned, I am based in Qatar, and this is by far one of my favorite paint brands here because it's affordable and has a really nice coverage after about 2 coats. You want to mix the paint well and pour it into a paint tray. Start by using a small brush to paint the frames. Start with 1 coat and then let it dry for about an hour before applying the second coat to the frames. As for the brush, I just used whatever brush I had on hand, and looking back, I probably should have used a more specific brush for this project so that my coats didn't look so streaky. But as you will see after the second coat on the frames, you don't even notice the streaks as long as you paint in the direction of the wood. Now that the wooden frames are done, it's time to paint the wall. I used a small, low-pile cotton roller for the walls. The reason you want it to be small is so that you can roll between the frames. By the time I finished the first coat on the walls, I was able to start on the second coat because it dried pretty fast. As mentioned, I only needed 2 coats. Now, for the really satisfying part, removing the painter's tape. I removed the painter's tape about 3 hours after I finished painting everything. At this point, the paint is not completely dry, but not too wet either. Now, let's look at the final result in the daylight. And just like that, you have your very own frame molded feature wall. I hope that you found this tutorial useful and easy to understand. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment box below. And also, I wrote a step-by-step guide on how to do this with all the visuals and answering all the questions that I might have missed in this video in a blog post, and I've linked that in the description box below for you. If you make this, please tag me at Sally Sarah Clark. And if you want to see more videos similar to this, please don't forget to subscribe and to like, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.
What do you think? Do you like it? Lala, do you like it?
For all useful and easy under you. Why do I always get that wrong? You. Also, what was I going to say?